Good afternoon, namaskar. A very warm welcome to the 16th edition of Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swast India at the Darbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce the session Crimson Spring, Navtej Sarna in conversation with Mandira Nayar. Diplomat and author Navtej Sarna's latest novel, Crimson Spring, brings to life the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 13th April 1919 through the eyes of ordinary individuals, soldiers, farmers, householders, dreamers, and rebels of Punjab, men and women, whose linked destinies impel them towards a horrific atrocity that changes their life forever. Crimson Spring is an intricate tapestry of known history, and its imagined layers a richly textured and detailed exploration of not only a barbarous act but also the indomitable spirit of sacrifice and heroism in earlier 20th century Punjab. Navtej Sarna has been a diplomat for nearly 4 decades and was India's ambassador to the United States. He has recently authored the novel Crimson Spring. His earlier books include the novels The Exile, We Won't Like Lovers Like That, the short story collection Winter Evenings, and several works of nonfiction. The session Mandira Nayar is in conversation with Navtej. Mandira Nayar has been a journalist for nearly 2 decades. She currently works with The Week magazine, writing on books, history, culture, and foreign affairs. She has worked with The Hindu and The Telegraph and is a Charles Wallace scholar. So, to Mandira and Navtej for Crimson Spring.
Hi, you can hear me, right? This is on. So, good afternoon. Welcome to a session post lunch, but I can assure you it's going to be a very interesting session. And I would like to congratulate Ambassador Sarna first by saying Crimson Spring has won the KLF, an awarded KLF. So, it's a really wonderful moment for us to talk about this book. And I wanted to start off with him saying that one of the aspects of this book which is quite which I really think is its strength is that the book is set in a historic period. It's set in Jallianwala Bagh, just before that and a little after, and he uses that memory of history to write this incredibly slender but almost epic book about Punjab, about this tragedy, about what happens. And I wanted to ask you that it wasn't an anniversary, and it certainly came after the 100th anniversary of the Jallianwala Bagh. And so, why the Jallianwala Bagh, and how did you come up with this? How did the story stay with you?
Well, thank you, Mandira, and thank you for sort of stepping into this session. I know that you were almost court-martialed into coming here at a very short notice. Thank you so much. And yes, I think that's Jallianwala Bagh is not related to a centenary. Of course, in this case, the fact was that 1919 and 2019, and a lot of people were talking about it. But I think it is something, it's an incident, it's an event, not an incident, which sort of lives in our memory, in our psyche very strongly. And there was always one of those things that you wanted, as writers want to write about a few things always. They say that, I wish I could write about this, I wish I could write about that. Normally that list, doesn't sort of materialize. Sometimes you collapse that list and try to combine it into 2 or 3 things into one. And that's exactly what happened with this book. I wanted to write about Jallianwala Bagh. I wanted to write about the Ghadar movement. I wanted to write about the revolutionaries. I wanted to write about the First World War. And life doesn't give you that much time or that much space or energy. So ultimately, what happened was that this book became a sort of, envelope for many of those things. And then, of course, its center is Jallianwala Bagh because it is such an important event in our recent history, and it has left an impact. It's become a metaphor for colonial oppression, and ranks with the massacres in the world, whether you talk of Katyn or you talk of Babi Yar, etc. And there's so many. So every country has its own thing, and particularly for Punjab, I think Jallianwala Bagh, you don't need to say more than simply those words.
So, you tell the story, and I wanted you to tell a little bit, sort of this thing for people who haven't read the book, and I would really, really recommend that you should. It's possibly the best book that came out last year. It really is stunning, but it is told through 9 characters, right? And each of them you've picked up, as they said, from ordinary life. Some of them have had, have a backstory that came from your personal life. So could you really talk about could you talk about the characters and why you chose them? And then can you talk about, talk about one of my favorite characters, especially in called Maya De. She's the only woman character, and you see the sweep of how it sort of touches everybody's life, but you see her, and she's sort of the only woman in this really large pantheon of men. She's also based on a historic character, and I will ask you to read from this thing, but could you talk about why you chose these 7 characters?
Yeah, 9.
Sorry, 9.
Yeah, thanks, Mandira. I think that's you see, to tell a story which covers many historical streams. There was Jallianwala Bagh, there was Ghadar, there was the revolutionary movement, there was the backdrop of the freedom struggle, and there was the entire, the revival of the Sikh identity, the Singh Sabha movement, the Gurdwara reform movement. All this was happening together at the same time. And the soldiers from First World War were coming out. So I adopted the rather sort of simplistic way of taking each protagonist to represent a historical stream, more or less. Some of them sort of overlap, but that was the idea behind these 9 protagonists and their backstories, and the fact that they all sort of cross at the massacre in some form or the other, or are touched and changed forever in some form or the other by the happenings of 1919. And so, there are 2 or 3 who are based on actual historical characters. And there are some who are entirely fictional. The ones who are based on fictional, the closest who comes to his reality is Udham Singh.
Yeah.
Udham Singh was a very real character, and he's a very real character in this book. And we follow his story more or less along his arc,
path,
and we'll talk about it whenever. And then there are others who are inspired by real characters. For instance, there are 2 British characters out of the 9, and those 2 are, conflicted human beings. I didn't want to show them as unidimensional, terrible chaps,
Yeah.
So they were human beings, and they had their doubts, they had their compulsions. So one of them is Hugh Potter, who's the Chief Secretary of Punjab at that time, working. He really functions as a witness to Michael O'Dwyer. He's very close to Michael O'Dwyer. So rather than telling Michael O'Dwyer's views directly, I tell them through Hugh Potter. And there's Hugh Potter's own life. Now, Hugh Potter was actually sparked off by a man called J.P. Thompson. J.P. Thompson was the real Chief Secretary at that time. He had no conflict. He had no doubt. He was a dyed-in-the-wool imperialist. And he was doing his job as harshly as he could. But Hugh Potter in this book is a conflicted character, but he's sparked off by J.P. Thompson. Similarly, there was an ADC standing behind Brigadier General Dyer when he ordered the massacre, and his name was William Anderson. So he just left a scrap of memory with his family about what he saw, and that was passed on by his family to another writer. And using that scrap of family, I've recreated the ADC. His name here is Nicholas Williams. And so I've created a world of Nicholas Williams, but that scrap of memory is real. What he sees is what the real William Anderson saw. And then there are a couple of them. You mentioned Maya Devi. She's based on one of the few women who actually gave testimony to the Congress Inquiry Committee in 1919, which was set up as a counter to the Hunter Committee. And there was a woman called Ratan Dey. And Ratan Dey actually historically is known to have spent the night at the Bagh looking for and then guarding her husband's body through the night. So it's a testimony is about a page or so. But you know, the Maya Devi in this, the rest of the story is fictional, her large backstory, etc. But that part is based on that. And then the others are actually, I think more or less all the others are actually fictional characters. There's a pleader called Gurnam Singh Gambhir, who's a vakil in Amritsar. Now, he is based on another man who gave testimony, a lawyer called Gurdayal Singh Salaria, who gave, you know, who was, so again, he was sparked off that. So it's a mix and match. There is some factual sources, some entirely fictional, like, you know, Mehtab Singh and Ralla, the others are all purely fictional characters. So that's why this is a pure, I mean, it's a fiction based on history. I don't know what is a historical novel, but it's a fiction based on history.
So can you read a little bit about Maya Devi? Because I think in some ways, she is the center of the book. You know, she's a character that stays with you. She's...
Yeah, she is, you know, she is actually, as you said, she is the, out of the 9, she's the only woman protagonist. So she brings a very different dimension, a very different sensitivity, a different point of view to the story. And she's also the heart of the book because she's present at the heart of the book. She's present just after the massacre. So if you have the time, I can read out.
Yes, could you read the bit?
Please do cut me off whenever you
no,
think it's
I think
getting
we should
too
read
long.
this thing in. It's worth reading because I think it's also so vividly written. It sort of leaves you with goosebumps, and I'm not going to.
Thank you. This is a chapter called "The Garden in the Garden of Desolation," and this is after the massacre. The massacre has taken place. It's night, and there's a curfew. Because there was a curfew prevailing in Amritsar at 8 o'clock, there will be nobody else. Even so, the wounded and the dead were lying where they were left. So this is the darkness thickened around Maya Devi. She could see 2 or 3 lonely lanterns swaying some distance away. Once in a while, a lantern would stop, stoop low, and then, already dimming with the disappointment, move on. What were the lanterns seeking, she wondered. Everybody was the same in death, one body the same as another, equally bereft of breath and life. Then she corrected herself as she looked down at her husband. Even in death, one needed to belong. Each person was looking for the one they had been born to, or given birth to, or shared a bed with, or perhaps just a meal. She heard a familiar voice and looked around. It was the younger son of Lala Sundardas. The boy, in that numb moment she could not recall his name, had come looking for her. She had rushed out of the house without telling anyone when she had heard the firing in the Bagh. "BBG," the boy said, and then stopped, his eyes fixed on Joga Singh's face, calm in death. His mouth fell open, and he could not say anything to her. She spoke finally. "Help me, Kaka. Call your brother. Let us take him away from here." "Yes, BBG," the boy said and rushed away, glad to be given something to do that would get him away from there. For an hour, Maya Devi waited, her eyes fixed at the point at which the boy had vanished into the darkness. A man carrying the dead body of a young boy over his shoulder was walking away, not too far from her. He seemed taken aback to see a woman sitting in this garden of desolation, among the dead and the dying. Then he seemed to understand that she was waiting for help. Bibi, it is difficult for people to come. It's past 8 o'clock, there is curfew. They are afraid of being shot. Everybody, even this, my only boy, has been shot. And the man trudged away under his heavy burden, each step taking him further into unending grief. The clock from the tower began to strike. She was not sure what hour it struck, perhaps 9 or 10. But she knew it was late. If no one was going to come to help her, then she must go herself and find help. She would go to Lala Sundar Das's house and get the boys herself. But they must be afraid of the curfew, otherwise they would have returned by now. But surely there must be people who would listen to her plea. Perhaps some of the students she had seen in the evenings, who studied and slept at the dharamsala attached to the temple complex in Ablova Katra. She picked her way through the piles of bodies, careful not to step on anyone or hurt anyone who might be wounded, or step into someone's blood. But without a lantern, it was impossible to be too careful. She found herself asking forgiveness from everybody and everything, and only one word kept quivering on her lips. Vaheguru, Vaheguru. He alone would guide her through the darkness, through that night. The temple compound was dark, its heavy door chained from the inside. She tried to push open the door, then knocked on it with the flat of her right hand. A window opened in the upper story of the house across the lane. A bald, middle-aged man, wearing a vest, was framed behind rounded iron bars. What is it, Mai? There is nobody in that dharamsala. The boys who were there have gone home for Baisakhi. Bhai Sahab, can you help me then? My husband? She could not bring herself to say the words. Her jaw quivered and tears began to flow down her cheeks. The man understood. I have 2 wounded men lying in my house, and I am the only one to take care of them. It is also curfew time. I wish I could help you, but look a bit further on. See if you can find someone. She walked on. There was nothing else to do. A man sat on a low charpai, smoking a hookah. Folding her hands, she told him what had happened and begged him for help. He turned to 2 men who were sleeping in the entrance to his house. Get up, you 2. Go with BBG to the Bagh. The men stirred, but they were not willing to go with her. What are you saying, Chaudhry? It's almost 10 o'clock. Isn't it enough that so many are dead today? Why do you want us to die too? Slowly, Mayadei walked back to the Bagh. She knew she had to be with Joga Singh, and she would stay there until someone came to help her, even if she had to wait all night. As she was about to enter the Bagh, her foot stepped on a lathi, the kind that peasants often carried when walking long distances. Its owner, lying face down in the drain, would not need it anymore, and she picked it up instinctively. She had seen dogs prowling among the bodies. Holding it in both hands, she returned to a vigil by Joga Singh's body. The boy to whom the soldier had given water was still alive. Mai, please stay here. Don't go anywhere, he entreated as he saw her return and sit down. I'm not going anywhere, child. My world is here, was all she could say as he shut his eyes. His breath came in low, wheezing gasps. She wished she had somewhere to give him water and something to wrap him in. But her dupatta was already soaked in the blood that had oozed from Joga Singh's forehead. A wounded bull was dying slowly nearby, and every few minutes Mayadei closed her eyes in pain as the animal bellowed hoarsely, kicking its legs in the night air. There was nothing she could do to ease its pain except pray, have mercy on the poor animal, Vaheguru. Grant it release. Slowly the night began to pass, marked by the striking of the clock on the hour. There was hardly any movement anymore, and only 1 or 2 lanterns could still be seen in the Bagh. There was no wind, as if it was staying away out of respect for the dead. With a last quivering croak, the bull too had fallen silent. Only the dogs barked, their noses covered with blood.
Should be.
I should end this. I'll just end this. Just after the clock struck 2, a peasant who lay not far called to her, "Mai, give a hand and lift up my leg." I'll skip this. Finally, she was about to count 5 chimes of the clock. It seemed that for an hour or so, she had fallen asleep where she sat, her husband's head in her lap. So this is how she spends the night.
And later, I mean, I think in Ratan Devi's testimony too, she's got that lathi and she's sort of keeping away the dogs.
She actually had to keep away the dogs, and then she waited till it was dawn, and then Lala Sundar Das and his boys come with a charpai and they take the dead body of Joga Singh away, and that's when people had begun to carry away their dead slowly, and the vultures were already, flying all over, and this is all, it's a fictional view of the night, but it's not very far from reality.
So, this is possibly one of the most haunting passages in the book. It sort of leaves you really shaken. It's something that you can't get out of your head. I couldn't. I still can't. And I wanted to talk to you about this idea of this memory that it is, regardless of whether you witnessed it or not, regardless of whether you read it or not. This memory of Jallianwala Bagh, and you talk about the fact that you wanted to always write about it. But, I've just been to Amritsar where in some ways the Bagh is still very much part of the landscape, not very far away from Darbar Sahib. Now Disneyfied, but yet sort of like this wound in the middle of this city. And I wanted you to talk about that. I wanted you to talk about this memory that you somehow inherit when it is about Jallianwala Bagh or when you write about Punjab, and the aspect of creating this or keeping it alive in a way at a point of time that, or the burden of literature to do it, or literally that you've done, where history sort of has not been able to keep up with that. So why, can you talk about that, this memory that you've inherited?
Well, it's, I suppose this is what writers, poets, painters, besides historians, do. I mean, everything needs an impulse from within. Everything creative in that sense needs an impulse from within. And people get an impulse from different things, It's something that has haunted you. For instance, you mentioned Punjab. I did write a story about Maharaja Dalip Singh.
Exactly.
But again, that was something which right from childhood was haunting me, in the sense that this talk of this young prince who was exiled and who was, converted to Christianity, and he left, and every Punjabi child, so Bachara Dalip Singh, they took him away, etc. So that was something which was, which, again, this sort of stories of Jallianwala Bagh, of the Gurdwara reform movement, Punjabis like you and me, we hear about it from our grandmothers, and everything in your family is linked to something. Of course, the most common link in our generation is partition. When partition happened, so-and-so was born. When partition happened, so-and-so was living there. It's a marker. Similarly, there, in earlier memories, now my grandmother would always tell us stories about how she would tend to the wounded at the Jaito Ka Morcha. When the Gurdwara reform movement went, it was a non-violent movement. So jathas would go and get beaten up by the colonial police on horseback and be beaten black and blue, and they would come and the women would be waiting in the Bagh, to take care of their wounds, to bandage them, etc., as best as they could. So, these, again, stories. So, and then, of course, there is always the story of Jallianwala Bagh. When Jallianwala Bagh happened, 10 years after Jallianwala Bagh, 5 years after Jallianwala Bagh, so-and-so was born. So these are, these are memories. So these are impulses which you then people can create things out of these. In many ways, some people more than others feel this kind of burden, this kind
Yeah.
of responsibility that somehow I have to tell my children, metaphorically speaking, the next generation, these stories, otherwise it will be lost. And that is why this book, my attempt is not just to write a history of the events or even a novel about the events, but to try and convey the flavor of life, the issues of life, the language of that time, although it's in English,
Yeah.
in a way of, so that Punjab that perhaps even we never saw,
Yeah.
certainly next generation is not going to see, but which exists in some books, in poems, in poetry, in memories of elderly generations still, could somehow be filtered, somehow be captured and passed on.
Yeah.
So these are, minor attempts, 100 such events possibly leave behind something for the next generation.
No, it's, you talk about this memory, but you also have this really wonderful line where Ralla's sister, Jind, says, right, that about stories. And can you just, this thing, I think, don't tell, you tell stories only during daylight, because at night, the person
that's the kind of thing, which you hear as children.
Yeah.
And you may not hear it as children of today will not hear this.
Yeah.
But I remember being told by grandmothers, if you say, tell us a story, and they will say, nee, we'll only tell stories at night, in the evening, when you're going to sleep. Perhaps it was a way of putting you to sleep. But that we'll tell you when it's sleep, because if you tell stories during the day, then travelers lose their way.
Right.
Now, this kind of thing, travelers lose their way. Who are these travelers? Why do they lose their way? If you tell me a story, but these are not queer. But this thing gets stuck in your head, and 50 years later, it comes out in something there. Similarly, the taste of the achar or the mardban.
Yeah.
So all those little
or the
things.
akhadas that you do this whole thing about wrestling.
The akhadas. Now the akhadas, akhadas figure heavily in this book.
Yeah.
Because I was trying to imagine this village. There's a village called Tibba, which I don't think exists anywhere, perhaps. So, but I thought of Tibba and I placed it in a certain geography. I placed it near Tarantaran and, placed it near the Satluj and Beas with a confluence, etc. for practical reasons of the geography of the book, Because another thing about this book is that this is the geography of undivided Punjab. This is actually, the geography of this book is the geography of the 5 rivers, and not 2.5 rivers. So it is the geography of the 5 rivers. So when I imagined that small village, I was thinking, what could there be in that village? There would be a theka, and there was.
And
there would be an akhada somewhere. Now, in this God-forsaken little village, the akhada and the theka are next to each other. And then the wrestler, who's a retired sort of wrestler, and teaching the youngsters, etc., he curses that chela, who's the theka owner, that he tells him, may thieves take your woman. You had to come and set this factory of hell. I make people healthy, you make them unhealthy. These two places can't exist in the same place. Lightning is going to hit this place. So these are little things, but the akhada gives you that earthiness of a village in early 20th century. What did they do? I mean, they would wrestle and throw things, and there were no games or kabaddi at best.
So you talk about Tibba, and in some ways, I don't know whether this thing, but Tibba is this imagined sort of place in your imagination, but also in some ways, and and I wanted to ask you this about this imagined idea of Punjab. The 5 rivers, this sort of almost utopia for a lot of people of pre-partition or partition. Partition sort of changes the geography of India. It certainly changes the geography of Punjab. It breaks the country, breaks Punjab into, sort of sunders it, and you leave with this wound. But you also in some ways, you've taken away its history. It's always hyphenated. And in 75 years of independence as we know it, we talk about revolution. We don't talk about the Ghadar party enough. We don't talk about Punjab's history. So this idea of imagined Punjab and why it's important at this point of time, where Punjab is increasingly being seen as a border state, where even the memories of '84, and I was in Punjab where I was at this university and this college, which was one of the oldest colleges, Hindu college, where the children do not remember '84, where it's sort of being wiped. Why do you think it's important to talk about this right now?
Well, partition, you're right. It's not just a physical partition. Because, the more damage, the more lasting sort of damage of partition, of course, we may be reconciled to the physical partition, but that it's actually partitioned your history.
Yeah.
It's partitioned your way of life. It's partitioned your language, and so much. If you just go 100 years earlier and you see, 125 years, 110 years earlier to Ranjit Singh's Punjab, you see a very different socio-economic setup of a united Punjab.
Yeah.
Ranjit Singh's court was, yes, it was the Sikh kingdom, but, his court was anything but purely Sikh. There were Muslims, there were Pandits, there were Dogras in very, very prominent positions, very powerful people. And so it was a truly secular kingdom in that sense. Now, all that is gone.
Yeah.
And today you do have a divided Punjab, you have a divided water system, you have a permanently divided societies. And I don't see any way out of it. But that doesn't mean that we forget what existed. That doesn't mean that you actually forget your heritage. If you're talking of the language of Varisha and Bulle Shah, then you can't be worried about borders or geographical borders. You have to take it as a concept, the entire thing. So that's why, as far as this book is concerned, it's a united Punjab. Because I decided that it's set in 1919. That was the reality at that time. But I think you're right. A lot of the other memories are fading, 84 and others. And again, these memories only survive if they are talked about and written about, or filmed, or painted, or, in some way depicted in an imaginative way, which attracts the other generation, which attracts the next generation. I wish all this could be put on Netflix. That would be one way of making sure everybody sees it.
I know, I think it should. I think that also the idea is that, I think what this book does is that history for all of us, and very contested as it is, maybe not Jallianwala Bagh that much, but it sort of tells you the facts. It doesn't give you the feeling.
But which is so important then, that when you are writing something based on history, you don't go completely off.
Exactly, true.
You don't create fiction and say, this is a novel. I've written about Jallianwala Bagh, but all this didn't happen, but I've written it because it's my novel. Because somebody is going to treat it as history.
Yeah.
And that somebody is going to be misled forever.
Yeah.
So it's your responsibility to hew as close to historical fact as possible, and clarify and write, what is not. For instance, this film on Shaheed Uddham, which you saw, I saw it two or three times just to try and read the disclaimer.
Yeah.
But the disclaimer sort of whizzes past at such speed that there's no chance anybody is going to read it. So anybody who's only read that part and didn't read anything else on Udham Singh is going to be convinced that Udham Singh spent about 6 hours hanging around Jallianwala Bagh and picking up bodies and taking them to this hospital which was waiting to take care of people. Nothing like that really happened.
Yeah. So, talking about that, you have Udham Singh, and, writers talk about how characters take over and they have a life of their own, but you've chosen very strictly to remain with Udham Singh historically.
Yeah.
But here was this man who carries this wound of Jallianwala Bagh. He chases Dyer. He finally manages, he goes to Africa. He works on the underground thing to sort of, unleash this burden that he has. And can you talk about him and why you stick to history? And as well as you're going to see this thing in prison, his gallows, right?
Yeah. No, Udham Singh is actually, as I said, he is the most historically correct protagonist here. And in many ways, he's the heart of the book, besides Mayadev, because he actually takes the story
forward
and completes it. He takes it from 1919 to 1940, and the narrative arc of the novel moves like that until he gets some sort of closure by assassinating Michael O'Dwyer. Dyer himself had already died in 1927 of natural causes. But Michael O'Dwyer, who was the lieutenant governor at the time of Jallianwala Bagh, was as much to blame as Dyer himself, who ordered the massacre, because he encouraged him, and then he approved it. And once he approved his action by telegram, then he was as much responsible. And he was the guy responsible for a lot else in Punjab, for the martial law, for the conscription for the First World War, for the Rowlatt Act coming into effect, for all sorts of other things. So Udham Singh had it in for him. And Udham Singh is a very, very difficult character to chase because he's so shadowy. And there's very little written about him. I mean, I know that Anita has done a biography and others have done a biography, but a lot of detail about Udham Singh is guesswork. So I had to, it was an advantage because I was not being unfair to anybody by creating things about him. But then the latter part is all recorded, and from his letters, from his, eyewitness accounts of his friends. So the latter part is all very, very true. But I gave him a voice. I gave him a mood. He's a very mood character. He's like a gypsy. He floats in and out. He is sometimes called Udham Singh. He's called Uday Singh. He's called Sher Singh. He's called Frank Brazil. He's called Muhammad Singh Azad, which he had tattooed on his forearm was Muhammad Singh Azad. So, he was a great character and the most unreliable of narrators. He'd say one thing today, another thing tomorrow, in court or otherwise. So he was he's an absolute treat for a writer. So I did, but you're right, I was very fortunate. In London, I did ask for permission and could go and see Pentonville Prison, where he was hanged on death row, where his body fell, the little patch of land, which is about the size of twice this stage, where he was buried for 34 years in an unnamed, there's a tiered graveyard under that, sort of wherever all the Irish revolutionaries, other people were hung there, but thank God to British record keeping, we still knew where his remains were. So 34 years later, when the government of India decided that we need to get those remains back, our High Commission could actually go and apply and actually identify the remains, and they were brought back. So there was a kind of rehabilitation in collective memory of Udham Singh, because when he did shoot Michael O'Dwyer, it wasn't a great move in terms of the leadership here. Gandhi called it an act of insanity. But a few years later, he was rehabilitated in his memory. So he's another one of those people whose memory needs to be restored. And unfortunately, we have done tokenism. We have a statue outside Jallianwala Bagh. I mean, that statue looks nothing like Udham Singh. And a few years ago, I actually visited that dusty little museum they used to have. I don't know what's happened to it after the Disneyfication. But at least in that dusty little museum, they had a picture of Udham Singh, which was the wrong Udham Singh.
Oh, God.
This was Udham Singh, the Ghadar revolutionary, whose picture they have put up there. I wrote after that to the director. I don't know if anything happened to change it or not. But so all sorts of things. So we do try to do things, but sometimes it becomes slapdash and tokenistic.
So do you want to read the last bit of Udham Singh and
Just if you have the time?
Yes, I think we do. Very short passage.
So the last bit is the only part of the book which is written in first person, and it's written in Udham Singh's as a kind of diary of Udham Singh. So the last portion is the day that he is hanged. 31st July 1940. This is the morning that I've been waiting for. I'm dressed in civilian clothes for the first time in the past 2 weeks. The priest has been with me for an hour. He has been talking to me of the God that awaits me on the other side of this journey. But I am only waiting to see Bhagat. See, his guru was Bhagat Singh. So he regarded Bhagat Singh as his God and everything else. But I am only waiting to see Bhagat. They are now at the door. I didn't hear them come. The rubber covering on the steps took care of that. The door opens. There are several of them, but there is only one man who is looking me in the eye. He must be the hangman. Hold out your arms, he says, and I stretch them forward. I feel nothing, only a very deep calm. He quickly pulls my arms behind my back and ties them at the wrist. The leather of the strap is soft and gentle. They have moved the wardrobe in the room, and behind it is a green metal door. It opens, and I can see the rope in the next room. This is the rope to which I am to be wed. Come with me, lad. You'll be all right, says the hangman, and leads me into the other room. I feel the warders gently holding my elbows as I step forward. They don't push me. They don't need to. There is a line made with chalk under the rope before which they make me stand. Another man ties my ankles together with a leather strap. I see the others in the room standing in a line, looking at me. The hangman is in front of me. He whips out a white handkerchief from his pocket. No, it's a white sack that he opens out. The sack is over my head even as the priest is saying the prayers. I see nothing more. I feel the noose around my neck, loose at first and then tight. Then the ground opens under my feet. I have become immortal. I have become one with Bhagat Singh.
So I'm going to ask you a last question and I'm going to open it up. You know, you talk about memory, and we've talked about memory in some ways as resistance to keep this alive. We've talked about Udham Singh, we've talked about restoration of him in India, but you know, there is always this aspect of colonial rule. And perhaps you know, post Jallianwala Bagh, and this thing, it is horrific when it comes to Punjab. And so 75 years later, we talk about revolution, we've talked about freedom, we don't talk about enough about how oppressive colonial rule is. Can you talk a little bit about that? And could you talk about maybe being able to talk about how oppressive it is within Britain itself? In some ways, how do you sort of ensure that the colonizers too recognize the oppression? Do you think that's ever going to happen?
Well, that's there's no doubt about it. Colonialism was repressive, not just in India. And, you know, there are histories which are coming out much and much. And there is currently, it's a good time to talk of these things because people are reviewing their past. Generations have changed. A certain set of values, you know, which could be, for instance, if you read the House of Lords debates on Dyer, you know, you think they're on another planet in the way those guys are talking. You know, they actually thought he was, you know, protecting the empire and the values of British Empire, etc., etc. But today, nobody talks like that. Nobody can talk like that. So I think in terms of, you can't change history. I don't think it's very wise to try and, you know, erase history as if it never happened. More important, it is to recognize history for what it was, to look it in the face and say, yes, this happened. We did this right and we did this wrong. And you know, face up to it. And then reparations are never really possible. They are never really complete. You know, yes, you can have an apology for something. You can have a 1 rupee reparation for something. This is all again tokenism. Rather than that, I would be happier or feel more satisfied, I would say, if, for instance, these stories, the stories of the Indian freedom movement, the stories of our revolutionaries, were maybe taught somewhere
Yeah,
in a
that's what I
British
meant.
university.
Yeah.
Maybe the syllabus could be changed to the sense of, bringing in the voices of the colonized. That is somehow perhaps the way forward. Not throwing every statue into the river and not, erasing as if things, because that is just another wrong. Then you're denying your own past, which is not true. I mean, your past is your past. Let's live up to it, good or bad.
Thank you. We're opening up for questions. We have a young boy right in front.
You spoke of 5 years after Jallianwala Bagh and 10 years after. Over 100 years later, what is the legacy of Jallianwala Bagh and what can we learn from it in 2022?
Well, 103 years later, I think the legacy is that this is the worst event in our colonial history that happened, that took place. Let's recognize it for what it was. Let's get its facts right. Please, let's get its facts right. For instance, it was not a collection of happy, jumping, dancing people, as some of the murals may tell you. It was not a collection of dozens of women sitting there. There were hardly any women. It was a political gathering. There were lots of people who were sitting there because they had nowhere else to sit. There was a Baisakhi cattle fair, which people had come to. So let's get the facts right. Let's not get our own history wrong while trying to rectify somebody else's history. That's one thing out of it. Second, understand that it was not a discrete one single event. It was part of a larger thing, and that's what this book tries to do. Where it fits into your freedom movement, what else was happening in Punjab at that time. I think these are the things, then you can see it in the proper perspective. So Jallianwala Bagh is not a picnic spot. Jallianwala Bagh is not a selfie point. So let's, get that right.
There was a gentleman there in the third row. Yeah. You, sir, you.
Navtej, you are not born when this incident took place. You haven't seen this geography personally, and much less you may have experienced yourself the kind of nuances you have brought out in the book, the culture, the feelings, various minor sensitive points. You must have done a lot of research, homework, to get to know them and put. Would you throw some light on that? What kind of research you have done to write the book like this?
Well, thank you. And nice to see you here. So there are some things which are ingrained in you, some things which you grow up with, some things which are in your blood. So a lot of Punjab, whether I've actually lived in those parts or not, or seen those parts, I don't need much research. It's there in me. So those things flow into your fiction or your whatever you're doing automatically. And there are a lot of things on which you needed solid research. First, of course, the main events. But then I did a lot of research on the Ghadar movement. I did a lot of research on the soldiers who went to the First World War. Because I wanted to get hold of a protagonist who belonged to a Sikh regiment or a Sikh battalion, which actually went and was recruited in this area, went to France, etc., went to Mesopotamia, and came back in time. So I actually found that. So you had to do a lot of research on the British side of things. I mean, that ADC's entire life, he belonged to something called the London Cyclists. So I did a lot of research on the London Cyclists, which was a territorial army unit sent here. So, you had to do a lot of, that's why this book took forever and forever to write.
Okay, thank you so much. Oh, one more question. I know they're all looking at me, but one more question. Yeah. We'll have one for gender, this thing to be equal. The lady there.
Hello. So I wanted to ask, I don't know if you've been to Amritsar in the last few years, but I went back in 2020 and I was surprised to see the area around Golden Temple completely Europeanized. So, what do you think about that? Like that area in Punjab with so much history and it's completely Europeanized now.
I couldn't agree with you more. I also saw it for the first time in that Italian marble situation a few years ago, and it broke my heart, to be honest. A lot of people say, oh, it's neater, it's fancier, the shops are better, but I think we could have cleaned it up in different ways. I agree with you completely.
Thank you
I
so
think
much.
we're done.
Ambassador Sarna is signing books. Please buy some and then ask him all the questions right there.
So we would like to thank Navtej Sarna and Mandira Nayar for this insightful session into the book Crimson Spring. The book signing station is outside, so you can have conversation with Navtej Sarna, you can ask questions, but we here are bound with time, so we have to finish the session here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ji.